A welcome to everybody, and thank you all for joining us on this lovely, warm Sunday morning. Just a few thank yous. Thank you to all the back staff in the office, Caroline. Thank you very much. Big thank you to Linda Sharp for introducing Gillian and myself to Betty. Absolute privilege to have sat and spoken to Betty a couple of times. She's a wonderful lady, and you're going to be thrilled hearing her talk about the war years. And so I'm going to thank Betty very much for agreeing to do this. Rebbetzen Lauren, thank you so much. I know your Sunday mornings are needed to be juggled around to do this, so really appreciate you talking to Betty this morning. So I'm just going to hand us over to you. So if you unmute, I'm going to mute.
Dear friends, chers amis, if there's any of my French friends listening in, I wanted to tell you, first of all, I wanted to say you couldn't have chosen a better date for me to tell my story, because Alan and I, my late husband, who passed away 2 years ago, were married on Rosh Chodesh Sivan, which is coming up on Wednesday, and the following weekend was Shavuot, was Shabbat and Shavuot, and this was my first introduction to South Hempstead community, which goes back 69 years ago, to save your mathematical minds. It certainly was a bit different then than it is now. First of all, it was in a hut, and secondly, it was called the Belsize Park and Regent's Park Synagogue. But we were made welcome, and although we spent most Shabbatot there, we almost every Shabbat walked over to Stamford Hill, because I'll come to it a bit later, because my Alan's parents and my mother were still living in Stamford Hill. Now, from this, I was going to thank a few people, but I'll have to leave it to the end, because Lawrence already thanked everybody. I want to begin by talking a bit about my family. I was born in Berlin on the 18th of January 1930 as the second daughter of a couple who had both individually come from Poland after the First World War. My father, Joseph Schütz, was born in Dukla, a small town in Galicia, in the south of Poland, where it's only really very predominantly Jewish. It's an enormous number of Jewish inhabitants in proportion to the others. And its actually only fame is a very famous football club called Dukla, Dukla Football Club. Now, my father was the second son was the youngest son of a second marriage. My grandfather, his father, his previous wife had died, and my father had two sisters and two half-brothers from his father's first marriage. I unfortunately did not meet any of his family, but my sister Ruth, having found the Afikomen one Pesach when she was about 8 years old, asked if she, as a present for finding the Afikomen, if she could join my father on his yearly trip to Poland. He used to go every year, first of all to visit his father's grave, who died shortly after the First World War, and then on to his mother, who had by then moved back to the small town where she was born, Novi Sad, where she lived with her daughter, divorced daughter, and her grandchild. Unfortunately, Ruth refused to go to Bobova, where my father's half-brothers were living, because she got too attached to my grandmother's beautiful, clean outside toilet, which she had not found anywhere else in the meantime. So she was lucky. Now, coming to my mother, she was born in a place called Cochin, which was about 20 miles from Dukla, slightly further inland. Dukla, incidentally, is in the foothills of the Tatras Mountains. And she had a very hard life because her own mother, died when she was during the First World War from typhoid, not the epidemic, what do you call it, the flu epidemic, but she had previously given birth to two twins, my aunt and my Auntie Betty, also called Betty, and Uncle Paul, who were 2 years old when she died. So my mother left school. She was barely 14, left school to look after her father and her twin brother and sister. Her older sister, she had an older sister, but she had already a grown and large family, so she could not leave them to look and could not accommodate her father and brother and sister also. My mother spoke very little about her childhood, but I gained a lot of information about their way of life from my uncle Marcus, who her oldest brother, who went to avoid being called up into the army, left for Berlin smuggled himself across the border to Berlin sometime during the First World War. My father was called up into the Austro-Hungarian army, as he was living on the Austrian-Hungarian border, and served during the First War. I have a photo of him in uniform. Unfortunately, I've mislaid it and it's not being shown today. But again, he spoke very little about his background, and so all the information I gained was mainly about their standard of life was from, as I say, from my uncle. But my grandfather had a shop selling leather and bales of leather, etc., and all the articles necessary for needed by shoemakers. And my father, apart from his yeshiva studies and other studies, also learned how to what is needed by shoemakers, which served him for a great deal afterwards. So they didn't meet. I always thought they met in Poland, but in fact they were introduced in Berlin, and they got married in 1924. And my older sister, Ruth, was born in a year later, 1925. There's exactly 5 years between Ruth and myself and my younger sister, Bonya, to whom I will come a little later. I'd like to tell you a little bit about this is a photo of my father and Ruth, the older one, and myself walking on a trip walking in the park My father loved walking and used to take us every possibility. He didn't work on Shabbat, of course, and didn't work on Sunday, so we spent a lot of time in. We were lucky. We were living near two parks, well-known parks, the Schiller Park and the Goethe Park. And he used to take us there, and also a bit further away to the Grunewald. If any of you know Berlin, this might mean something to you, which is, similar to Hampstead Heath. Now, as I said, having learned the trade, my father opened a shop selling. This photo of my father in his shop with selling goods, anything needed by cobblers or shoemakers, and also one or two leather handbags, etc., but not many, mostly rubber, what do you call them, rubber heels, to reheal, because people used to do their own rehealing and cut up bales of leather for shoemakers. He was very, very highly regarded by the local community. We lived in, when I was about 3, we moved to, previously my parents had lived, and Ruth had lived in the Grenadierstraße, the center of the Jewish life in Berlin. But we, like the East End was in the old days, but we moved, when I was about 3, we moved to a different area, which was called the Northwest. I lived in Northwest 65. I've never moved far from Northwest, apparently, which was called Red Berlin, because it was purely very much a work, slightly communist workers, and down, it wasn't a high class. We had 1 or 2 Jewish neighbors, friends or neighbors, but predominantly it wasn't a Jewish area at all. I went to school in, there was a school opposite where we lived, or our apartment was above the shop on the first floor in a big building, a 6-floor building, and there was a school across, a primary school across the road, to which I went, and my subjects, my favorite subject was reading. Now, I was very advanced in reading because Ruth, being 5 years older, taught me to read much before I actually got to school. Because school age in Berlin was, in Germany at the time, was 6. You didn't start school until you were 6 years old. So I remember one day reading Uncle Tom's Cabin, and I started crying, of course in German, and started crying, and my father, it's the only time I really remember my father getting very cross. He snatched the book away from me, and he said, "I don't want you to cry over a book." And it's one of the memories I've never forgotten. The only other occasion he got very angry, he got a bit annoyed with me, was I loved Cheder. I went to a Cheder, and I remember last night thinking about it. The name of my teacher came back to me. He was called Herr Dr. Rabbiner Alexander. No, Herr Dr. Rabbiner Alexander. So we had to address him as such. But I loved going to Cheder, and I used to go once a week, and one day I think I got ready, and my father was busy in the shop, and I kept on nagging him, "It's time to go," and he said, "Betty, I'll get you there in time." And it's one of those things which have remained in my mind.
Betty, I was going to jump in from there, perhaps, to tell us how everything changed in 1933.
Right, everything changed. Well, I was only 3 years old, so I didn't realize at the time how much things changed. But I first became aware of what was going on because I was reading, and at the bottom of our road there was a official reading display paper,
like a billboard.
A billboard of the Stürmer, the Nazi newspaper, and I read the Jews are dirty and the Jews are horrible. We have to get rid of the Jews, and this, of course, stayed in my mind. Then they painted a notice on my father's shop: "Kauf nicht bei Juden, don't buy from Jews." And I heard them marching down the street, shouting their vile songs, "Death to the Jews," etc. So I was quite even before my father was deported, which I'll come to in a minute. I was quite aware of what was going on, and slowly things became more difficult. And on the 28th of October 1938, at 6 o'clock in the morning, there was a knock at our door, and there were 3 Gestapo officers outside arresting my father to deport him to Poland, because it was Poland was going to restore all Polish passports from people living outside, from Poles living outside Poland, and the Germans wanted to get rid of the Poles, so they arrested all. My mother, unfortunately, wasn't arrested because she had a Czech passport. Due to the change of, the areas where they lived changed hands every few minutes. So they arrested him, and they didn't even give him a chance to say goodbye to us. And that was the last time I saw my beloved father. We later found out that very much later found out from the Red Cross that he had survived several ghettos, Buchenwald, and finally met his end in Bergen-Belsen in January 1945, to believe it or not. We believe, because he was registered when we got this information, which was terrible for us, that he had survived all this time and then, died, or disappeared, because they have no knowledge of it. But he probably served as a shoemaker during that period. That's what we think, because he's registered he had a red thing for his, I don't know what you call it, in the camp, which is a political. He wasn't political, so it must have been professional. Right, I know time is running short, so.
Well, so after that,
no,
suddenly you're left alone at home, the 3 girls, just with your mum, and you've got a shop to still take care of.
My mother was told that she had to vacate hand the shop over to non-Jew. She was given up to this. This was in October. Oh, incidentally, this October, this first transport of Jewish deportation of Jews was the precursor to the Kristallnacht, because one of the people who were deported together with my father was Greenspan, the young man father, who was so upset about the whole thing that he shot a diplomat in Paris, and this Greenspan, and this was the excuse for Kristallnacht, to put it into perspective. Now we were told, my mother was told that she not only had to sell the shop, hand it over, not sell, but also that we would have to vacate our apartment. And she was given the 2 months to do so. And Ruth, even she wasn't quite 14 yet, was very aware of everything, and she said, I must find a way for us to get away. She went, she primarily, first of all, went to the Youth Aliyah, and she was told, because I had a cousin already in Palestine who'd gone on Youth Aliyah a year before, and she was told that she was too young for Youth Aliyah. She should come back the following year. Then she tried to get onto a Kindertransport, but she was told that they had to look after their own children first, which meant children born in Germany rather than Poles like us would just.
Although you were German born, but your parents had come from Poland.
That's it. We weren't considered German Jews. We were considered Poles. So she then, as she was at the Kindertransport, she overheard some girls talking about going on a train to Belgium, and she found out that this train was leaving, where they were adopted by foster parents, etc. And she found out that this train was leaving on the 22nd of February 1939. So she came home and told my mother, what I suggest, to get away, you should buy, Betty and I, tickets for England, to pretend that we were going to England. We would get onto the train and mix with the kinder going on the Kindertransport and go to Belgium. And believe it or not, my mother agreed, which is incredible, because I feel she was so brave to send us into the unknown, because she didn't know. She said, well, the worst comes to the worst, you come back, and you'll go to Poland to be with my friend.
How did you feel when Ruth started talking about you going on this train that you didn't really have?
It didn't worry me. I left it all. I absorbed it. I knew it needed to be. It was something which had to be done. We had to get out, and this was the way out. And but I'm fully convinced that my mother took it upon herself, and it was the first time that she really made decisions for herself. Because my father was the head of the family, and I feel that in my heart that if my father had been there, I wouldn't be here to tell my story, because he would never let us go. He was too anxious.
Would have wanted to keep everyone together. So tell us now, you go onto the train, the two of you.
So we got onto the train, and it was hard. It was a very cold day in February, and we said goodbye to my mother. But before leaving, she had brought me a beautiful handbag, shoulder handbag, a leather handbag, which I treasured, which I was very fond of. And she managed to, eventually the train left, and she managed to, I don't know how, to meet up with us at the next station to wave to us again. Incredible. Now we were on our way to Belgium, and the kinder all by the border in Aachen, the kinder were all issued with identity tags, but obviously Ruth and I didn't have any. There was actually in Cologne, yes, identity tags. And when we got to the border guard, the Belgian border guard came on board and said, where are your tags? So the first word I learned in French said, descendez, who asked us to get off the train. Now Ruth knew some French because she was in secondary school and she'd learned some French and she told me to sit quietly and not to move. And about maybe half an hour later, the same order guard came through again. He said, "Continue, carry on." The second word of French I learned. We arrived in Belgium, and the welcome wasn't very, very warm. The committee, as we weren't expected, they were limited to 800 Kinder, not like in England, 10,000, but 800, and we were 802. So they said, somebody said to us, "We've got legal children, illegal ones we don't need." This was so I remember. And finally they said, "Well, what can we do with you?" So he said, "We'll send you to the Salvation Army." Now, for us, coming from a religious home, Salvation Army was the last straw on a terrible day, and we both burst into tears. Now, luckily, amongst the children which hadn't been collected yet by their foster parents, there was a girl who was a couple of years younger than Ruth, but she knew her from her school, and she asked the person who was collecting her foster mother whether she would take us in as well. And this wonderful family, Padova, took us in. She took us in, and I was there for 2 weeks, and then arranged with the local community, with the Belgian Refugee Committee, for us to join a hostel for girls near Brussels, but just on the outskirts of Brussels, but closer to the German border. And it was called the Home General Berman, which they rented this place. And we joined the other. I was one amongst. There were 50 of us, all without family in Belgium, and I was amongst the youngest. Now, in the summer of 6 weeks before war was declared, my mother managed to get a visa as a domestic, to come to England as a domestic. How did she get this visa? She retained she didn't have a Polish passport, she retained her Czech passport in her maiden name. And she then came through Belgium on her way to England with Bonia, was my younger sister, who was born, I forgot to mention her, she was born in 1935, exactly 5 years younger than I. So I was big in the middle. Now, Bonia at the time was just in 39. She would have been, I was 9, she would have been 4. And my mother thought that she could take her to England. But then when it was time for her to leave, the committee said to her, "On no account can you take Bonia, because the Home Office would send you both back," which was true. It's she can't arrive as a job on her as a maiden unmarried woman without a child, with a 4-year-old child to work as a domestic somewhere. I won't go into the story of how she worked in England, because how she was treated wasn't very good, but that's another story.
So Bronya stayed with you.
Yes,
and
so
Ruth
Bonia,
took it
my
upon
mother
herself.
had to leave her with. Can you imagine my mother's feeling of leaving a 4-year-old as well as us? Now, she was too young for our hostel, so they decided to send her to an orphanage. And we were given permission to visit once, and she was in a terrible state. How are we doing for time?
We're okay.
she was given she was in a terrible state because she was all alone, 4-year-old, without her parents, and cried bitterly, but there's nothing we could do. We couldn't. So we couldn't. There's nothing.
It was out of your control.
Out of our control.
Before we move on to leaving the hostel, you spoke about you crying when the thought that you might have to go to the Salvation Army because the identity as from Jews was so strong. But it was during the time you were at the hostel that it was Pesach.
Is that
right?
Yes.
Because that's a story that always we tell it over in our home every Pesach.
Well, whilst we were in Belgium in the home, they decided first of all I had my tonsils removed, and my sister who wrote about our story doesn't even know that didn't even remember that I was in hospital. But I never ate very much, and my mother used to chase me around our apartment with spinach, which to this day I don't like. But they decided to send me to a Flemish, in the countryside, to a Flemish couple in the countryside, so that I could, put on some weight or something. But the date they chose happened to be Pesach. Couldn't have chosen the worst date, and I refused to eat until the committee sent me a box of matzahs.
And you were 7. Were you 7 at this point?
I was 9.
9.
I was 9, just 9, yes. My mother didn't wear a sheitel. My father didn't have a beard, but we were a traditional, slightly, perhaps a fraction above United Synagogue, to put it into context.
So then everything changed again when war broke out.
Now, war broke out on the 4th of May 1940, and we were given literally a couple of hours' notice that we were going to leave 4 days later, that we were going to leave for Belgium, for France, to escape to, because it was becoming dangerous. So because we could hear the German guns in the background, etc. We were right on the border, and we were told to get dressed. We were in the hospital was in care of a young couple, a Jewish couple, who had Alex, had studied in Palestine, agriculture in Palestine, and he'd come back to Belgium to work, I don't know as what, in agriculture, and they were put in charge of this hospital. They were very young, they were only 25 at the time, and he in fact was called up into the Belgian army, so Elka, his wife, was on her own when she was given just a couple of hours notice that we had to make a move. So she told us to get dressed, and according to my sister's book, to which I will refer in the future, we were told to put on more than one layer of clothes, and we set off for Brussels. Now, in Brussels, we met up with another hostel, a Jewish boys' hostel, again about 50 boys, and we together left for the station. Now, there was pandemonium at the station because the whole of Belgium, remembering the First World War, was on the go, trying to escape to France. At the end of a long day, we were luckily, I am not 100% sure, maybe a brother of Alex managed to get us 2 wagons, goods wagons, one for the girls and one for the boys. So we were 50 in one and 50 in the other. And the boys we had taken, the girls had clothes, but the boys never forgave us. They always said, you took clothes, we took food. Because they came with some food, but how much food can one provide for 100 children? Take away for 100 children. So we had a 4-day journey through from Belgium to the southwest France. A horrendous trip, and one of the things I've never forgotten was that I had to use my mother's most beautiful handbag my mother had given me as a toilet, because there were no facilities. Occasionally, when we stopped at some stations, some of the locals came up and brought us some milk or so, but literally we were left on our own for 4 days. We have eventually arrived in a small village in southwest France, called, it's not important, and we were given we were given a barn by the local squire, and there was nothing there. There was nothing in the bar except straw. It was used for cattle, and the boys had to go to the local church to bring benches so that we could have
somewhere to sit,
and also to eat. To eat from.
But you slept on the straw.
We slept on the straw, and that was my worst thing, because I was always cold. Ruth always got warm very quickly. I was always cold, and I could never get warm. And conditions there were very difficult. Ruth had she came out in boils, and it was really very difficult. But one of the Belgian committee ladies arranged with whose husband, who had also escaped to France, whose husband was knew some official in Red Cross, arranged with the Swiss Red Cross to provide us with to find us another home. He said they can't live there. We were there for a year and a half. They can't live there much longer. The boys went ahead. They found the Chateau de Leilly.
And I think Lawrence has a picture of where you were located in France.
Yes.
And
no,
is it, isn't it?
That was the chateau. So, yeah, this is I don't know if you can see it, but this is where we were, what area we were in, where the arrow is. Now, this was a chateau, hadn't been used for 40 years, but it had two luxuries as far as we were concerned. It didn't have toilets. It had a piano, and it had what's the second luxury? Oh yeah, beds.
Beds.
The Swiss Red Cross provided us beds, so we didn't have to sleep on the straw. I was still, I used to get up once every hour during the night to go to outside to the latrines, because I was still cold. I still couldn't sleep, but food didn't worry me at any time, but cold worried me. Now,
so from there, that's when you and Ruth were then split up again. Is that right?
Well, we were there. We were in different groups, and Ruth was I was called the middle group. There was the small one, the youngsters, the middle group, and the oldest. Now, Ruth was amongst the eldest, of course, and the older ones were teaching the younger ones, because, to teach us something. So Ruth was our group leader. I was lucky because the very young ones were sent to the local school, but I, thanks to Ruth and perhaps a little bit of protection, I'm not sure, I remained in the middle group, and I was taught by, all I know is, by then our teacher was Alex Frank's mother, who had come from Belgium to join us, and taught all the French I know. I owe to her. She was. We thought she was ages old. She was only 50, but she was, and she was, she was a bit strange, but wonderful woman. And all the arithmetic I learned was from one of Ruth's, one of the older boys, who was very gifted, and he later became a teacher in Israel in mathematics.
Now tell us about Ruth's journey from there.
Now, in 1942, in August 1942, one morning the chateau was surrounded by local, not the Germans, I'm glad to say, but the local police, local police officers who arrested, who took away all over 15, all the boys and girls over 15. Ruth wasn't with us at that time because she had gone to work for a Swiss farmer about 2 hours from the chateau, but they found her. She was registered. The local community, they knew where we were, and they arrested her as well. They took her to the Camp de Vernet, which was later became a concentration camp. Previously had been used for Spanish refugees from Spain who had fought against the fascist regime in Spain. On the brink of deportation from this place, the Swiss Red Cross managed to get them out, and the whole group, because the leader of the Swiss Red Cross went to in France without permission from Switzerland, went to see the head of the Vichy government and say, if you don't liberate these children, we will seize all work in France with children's homes. And there were a lot of children's homes, not only Jewish ones. I mean, we were the only couple of Jewish homes, in fact. And so they let us go. Now, having been once, they said they couldn't be sure not to be, this wouldn't reoccur. And groups of people left, of our comrades left, to either get into Spain or to get to Switzerland, across the border. Some of them were sent back by Switzerland, being over 16 at the time, and we lost 10 of our comrades through. They couldn't. They were taken away and they didn't come back.
Tell us about your narrow escape when you had to cross the border.
That's I'm not quite ready.
You're not there yet,
no,
okay.
Because I have to tell you about Ruth. So Ruth joined was one friend, and the help of somebody who helped me eventually, Eugen Lehrer, crossed the border to. I'm taking too long. Managed to get to Lyon, where they were supposed to meet somebody, but he'd been arrested, and a very difficult journey. They ended up in Grenoble. Now, in Grenoble, Ruth was, after doing several jobs, etc., she by chance met up with the MJS, the Mouvement Sioniste Juif in France, and they asked her to join their group, and their resistance was to get children across the border, Jewish children across the border to Switzerland. And one of their comrades was caught, not with a group, but on her way back, She was caught by the Germans. She was tortured and didn't give away any secrets, and killed. And eventually, she's now reburied in Israel, and Yad Vashem have created a little park in her honor on the French side of the pavilion, near the French pavilion of Yad Vashem. Ruth, during this time she was working for the MJS, she heard that they had been told that there was a child who would be, the Germans were going to arrest her, and they, at any moment, her parents had been left her in an orphanage, and the Germans found out she was this Jewish child. So Ruth volunteered to dress up as a German officer, marched herself into the orphanage, and asked for Corinne, was her name, and the matron didn't want to release her, but she said she's no problem. So Ruth said in her very good Berliner accent, which is still maintained, said, if you don't release her, we'll close the orphanage, finish. So she gave her, and Ruth took her to a safe house. And years later, Corinne is her name, turned up and knocked on the door of Ruth in Israel on the kibbutz. And when Ruth opened the door, she said, "Je suis Corinne." It just said that whoever
20 years, was this 20 years later or so?
It was, yeah. She finally managed to get to Israel. A long story, I can't get into her story, but she managed to trace Ruth, and she thanked her. She said, "You gave him a second life."
Did you know about any of this during the war, or you only found out afterwards about how
About
involved?
Corinne, I didn't know. Then Ruth said, "I'm helping other children to cross to Switzerland, so I must do something for Betty." I was still in the chateau. She was the help of somebody I like very much, one of the Swiss persons in charge of the. He took us on his bicycle took me to the nearest station, and went overnight to Annecy, near the Swiss border, and I wasn't frightened. But I was a bit frightened when we arrived in Annecy, because the whole station was full of German officers and checking papers. So Eugen Lehrer said, "Don't worry, if they ask me," I said, "you're going to to the other children's homes." Red Cross had plenty of children's homes. Again, he took it upon himself. He had no authority to do so. And he left to go back. He had to go. We said goodbye to him, and I met with Ruth. It was fantastic seeing her again. And she said, "But I have bad news for you. You're leaving tonight for Switzerland." So she took me to a little cafe, and we had an ice cream in Annecy, and we said goodbye. I didn't really want to go, but I realized there's no way I could. Now, I crossed the border with the family of one of her colleagues on the MJS, and father, mother, and 2 children. And the border guard told us, "I can only take you up to 2 barbed wire fences. The third one you have to cross on your own." And he told us where to go, but I don't know whether I misheard or somebody misheard. Anyway, the girl and I, who was more or less my age, decided to go straight ahead, and it was either straight ahead or to the left, and we heard German voices from the distance. So we quickly went back, and we all found this third barbed wire fence, and we crossed into Switzerland. Now, the border guards, the Swiss border guards, said you were very lucky because you almost ran into the hands of the Germans. And they took us to be interrogated by the the committee, by their what can I say, the local headquarters. And they asked me my particulars. I gave my name and date of birth, etc. Then they asked me, how did you come? I said, I don't know, because I wasn't allowed to say how I came, obviously. And he said, why did you come? And I said, I'm asking myself that. I remember that so. They didn't even offer us, that was by then, it was 8 o'clock in the morning, we'd been out all night. And they didn't even offer us a drink or something. Then they took us to a local camp, which was in Geneva, Camp de Charmy. And we arrived and we saw it was surrounded by guards with dogs. And I thought to myself, are we refugees such a danger to Switzerland that they have to, guard us with dogs? I won't talk about my stay in the. I was in several refugee, several of their camps, for about 4 months, up to the time I was adopted by a local, taken in by a local Swiss family. Being nearly 14 by that age, I'm curtailing it because I know we're running short of time. Being nearly 14 years of age, they decided there was, this was in October 44, that I was no longer off school. I was in Switzerland, you went to school up to the age of 14. So she decided, and the family decided that they would send me to a school. I wanted to become a kindergarten teacher. They asked me what I wanted to do. And they decided to send me to a school for to learn how to clean and clean in German.
So you could help them?
Well, I don't know. It was, well, how can I say, Schaffhausen, this wasn't Schaffhausen, a small Swiss, but Schaffhausen of those days is not the Schaffhausen of today. I mean, if a woman walked around with lipstick, they thought she was a fallen woman, It was very, very provincial, and and my family were strict Protestants and very church-going, and
but those were lonely years for you, weren't they? The time you spent there was lonely compared to...
I was terribly lonely, and I also felt, because I didn't have my comrades, I didn't have, what kept me going in France before was reading. We read non-stop, and that was my savior. I read, the only book I hadn't read in France before I came to England, I was Gone with the Wind, because there was too much demand. It was too much in demand by all the people who were perhaps slightly older than I was.
And
anyway,
before we get to post-war, just going back to Chateau Lahy, I mean, people stayed in touch and you looked for each other after the war. Yes. And there's even a museum now there, isn't there?
There's a museum there which the local community set up, and in our name, the Musée des Enfants du Château de Lahy, and this is it. And I sent them, of course, when Ruth wrote a book called
This is you meeting. This is a reunion with everybody.
That's one of the
one of them.
Yes. This photo is it's a bit much later. Is
okay.
Our golden wedding. Sorry.
So this takes us to liberation, right? Are we up to liberation?
We are up to the end of the war.
Yes.
And
your mother.
Before I left Schaffhausen, or once Schaffhausen was bombed by mistake, because the Germans thought it was on the border with Rheinhausen, and the Americans thought it was Germany. And also, the other thing important for me, in Schaffhausen there was no synagogue. But in Weinhausen there was, because that is where they was. So after the war, before the end of the war, my family heard of a family of somebody in Bern who needed somebody to look after her, and they asked me if I wanted to go to Bern, to look after this lady who was very ill, and I said by all means, because there in Bern there were other of my comrades from the Chateau d'Ailly. So and I joined a local Zionist organization, and my first boyfriend, actually called Alex, who got married on the same day as we did. He took me to my first opera, Tales of Hoffmann, and my mother. During the war, I don't know. Have we got time? For
Yeah,
that?
I think can we go to when your mother then you come and join her in England?
Yes, well, my mother having, this is what I'm going to say. My mother, during the war, applied for a permit for us to come. The Home Office, she did so much without knowing the language, etc., for us to come over to England. And the reply from the Home Office, well, she had to send £60, which was a fortune for her at the time. The reply was, if your children can make their way to Portugal, we'll bring them over. Now, to us, in 1942, how did we get from the Chateau d'Ailly to Portugal?
It's impossible.
It was like going to the moon.
Yeah.
So on the strength of this visa, my mother, as soon as the war was over, reapplied for me to come over. And she and I arrived in London. Ruth, in the meantime, after she rescued this child, she was wanted the Gestapo were looking for her. So the committee decided, her colleagues said, you must leave for Spain as soon as possible. She managed to get 4 days over the Pyrenees. Very hard. But she managed to get to Portugal, to Spain, and then from Spain she got to Cadiz, and from there she went on a legal boat to Palestine, not illegally, and she had a very hard decision to make, whether to come to London to rejoin my mother or fulfill her dream of going to, because it's been her lifetime.
And the introduction of her book, she writes so poignantly how this had been her dream. And even your father used to speak about Israel so much.
Absolutely.
And for Ruth's children, having founded the kibbutz, Israel's a given.
That's right.
So she really kind of folled through with that dream.
That's right.
So tell us about now Bronya. Bronya's the...
No, Bronya, unfortunately, as we couldn't tell, there was no way Ruth felt terrible, because my mother had put her in charge of Bronya, and there was no way she could she was 2 hours away from us. No way, no communication, etc. So she stayed behind in Belgium. And again, thanks God, somebody found out that there was a child who was on her own without any family, and went to somebody and said, I had a non-Jewish friend, business acquaintance, and said, look, there are 2 children on their own, you must save them. And one who eventually became Bronya's foster father went home to his wife, and his wife said, why don't you bring her? So the next morning he went to Belgium, to Brussels, and they were near Antwerp, in a small place near Antwerp, and he arranged for Bronya took Bronya, and they were wonderful to her. They passed her off as a niece, and because at the time she only spoke French, and they are Flemish part of. Anyway, they sent her to school, and they did all this at the risk of their own lives, because they had teenage children, and they had to take Germans in to give them, lodging to Germans, but they passed her off as one of the family. And one year, eventually, I came to London in October 45, and Waldman's foster father brought her in the summer of 46, because his wife said, I will only let her go if you can take her to England, and if you can promise me to bring her back, and if you find that her mother is not the sort of person to leave her with. I could go on forever and ever,
Yes.
but
and I'm sure there'll be some questions. So perhaps finally, just tell us about how you then, post-war years, you're in London.
Because of my post-war years, because of my knowledge of French, I applied for a job in was an importer of French watches, whose office was in a place called Cambridge in Albany Mansions, at the corner of Cambridge Circus and Cambridge Circus and Charing Cross. And the whole building, apart from us, we occupied the top floor. The whole building was offices, Bachat, B'nai Akiva, Zionist Federation, Mizrahi, Zionist Federation, the whole lot. And I, of course, in my lunchtime, I went down to chat to them, be friends with them. And one of the people in there, Alan, in the meantime, had served in the Royal Air Force, and as soon as he was demobbed from the Royal Air Force, he went to Israel to volunteer as just after the War of Liberation in Israel, and to volunteer for the Israeli Air Force. He was a radar instructor, so it was wanted. And he only came back he was going to make his life in Israel. In fact, he went to Kibbutz Lavi and advised them to set up a radio manufacturing company, but it didn't come to anything. He left all his goods in whatever he had in Israel, and he came back for his brother's bar mitzvah, because his brother is 9 years younger. So
and that's when you met.
Well, he came. One of his friends was working there. The house needed rewiring. So his friend Uri Blitz said, Alan, are you interested in rewiring the building? So he said, yes, I'm here for a couple of weeks. Why not? I'm an electronics engineer, and I can earn a little bit of money. And of course, who had the keys to the building was my boss. So he came to me every morning for the building, for the keys, and in the evening he brought them back. So after a couple of days or so, he said, would you like to come? And we had a lot in common, because he had come back from Israel. I had my sister in Israel already. And he said, would you like to have a cup of coffee? So we went to Soho to have a coffee. I always tell everybody, because we were on the Soho was at our back. So I always said I met Alan in Soho. And when it came to paying for the coffee, you realized he had no money on him. So I paid for our first rendezvous. His parents lived in Stamford Hill, and although they weren't members of the United Synagogue there, his father was in the Yadas. My mother went to United Synagogue, and Alan used to come to. He had a lot of friends there, so he used to come to shul, and we met in shul, and slowly we decided we were getting married. I said to Alan before he died, not long before he died, I said to him, did you ever ask me to marry you? He said, I can't remember. I said, I can't remember either. Now, as I said before, we got married on the...
This week. This week's the anniversary.
Yes, this week would have been our 69th anniversary, Rosh Chodesh Sivan. 1952. And we had a happy marriage for 67 years. I can't complain. And we always kept up, although pre-Shlomo Levin, Rabbi Shlomo Levin, we had moved our membership to, I must emphasize this, pre-Robert, your father-in-law's tenure, we had moved our membership to St. John's Wood, where Anne eventually became a warden. And I must, from that time, well, very often, David Turner, who I must mention as one of the people I know from the old days, used to ask us to come back to South Hampstead. And although unkept up, although no longer a member, he felt it his moral duty to do security for South Hampstead, and would do security first thing in the Shabbat morning, then walk over to St. John's Wood because he was a warden there.
Amazing.
And another person I must mention is my shul neighbor in South Hampstead was Stephen Lawson's mother for many years, because then we had allocated seats, and she was my shul and then me.
Betty, I know we've only touched the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more we could talk about, but I'm sure people are going to have questions.
Okay, I'm ready
look, as you know, I treasure our friendship, and I think one of the amazing things is that you're so unassuming that actually people would never guess the absolutely extraordinary story, you know, and just these few years of your life which you've taken us through this morning. And perhaps it's a good opportunity before we open to questions to mention these books.
My wonderful sister Ruth wrote a book. Her first book appeared in, of course, in Ivrit, and it was eventually, and it was received with great. They had to reissue a second edition because it was sold out. It received a lot of wonderful comments. Then my late brother-in-law, asked me if I could be helpful in translating it into English. Now, my problem at the time was that I wasn't computer literate. So by the time he died and I was computer literate, it was, you know, I got my nephew, my eldest nephew. I don't know if you managed to get a photo of.
Lawrence, do you have the photo of Betty's nephews there? Her sister with her sons in Israel? No. Okay, well, people can.
No, it doesn't matter.
Shall I hold the book? Do you want to hold the book up so people can see it?
My sister's book was translated.
Okay, I'm going to put it closer to the camera. Can you see that? A girl called Renee can order it off Amazon.
Off Amazon, yes. And subsequently, I sent the English copy, a girl called Renee, to the museum in the Chateau Lahy, and they decided they wanted a French translation. So it was translated into French, a much superior translation, also including my chapter.
The beginning of this has also Betty's chapter, so for any French speakers, it's at the end. There we go. And there's one more book that also has
that
your
is
story.
my story in We Remember, which is issued by the Association of
yeah, this was the child refugees telling their story. So there's Betty also has a chapter.
I'm 16 years old before they came to England. That's got my chapter. It's got 30 chapters of different people. We wrote them ourselves. They were slightly edited by various people, but only slightly. But virtually they are our own story. But far and beyond all translation is the French translation.
Yeah. Betty, are you happy to take some questions?
Yes.
Lawrence, do we have time for some questions?
Of course we do.
Okay, we will mute.
Okay, so because we've got a problem with the echoing, Betty is having to mute. So if you've got a question, raise your arms. I'm going to look across. Okay, Linda. So I'm going to mute, and Linda, you can ask your question and then you quickly mute after you've asked it.
Okay. But it's hello, can you hear me? Hello. I just want to say I've known Betty since the 60s, the late 60s, and I had no idea her story until I read the book. I knew some of the story, but all I can tell you is the book is absolutely amazing. It's breathtaking, and it should be made into a film. I've read every book on Holocaust because unfortunately I've got survivors in my family, or fortunately they survived. But this book is phenomenal, and I can just say everyone should read it because our member Betty is something very, very special.
Thank you, Linda. Anyone got a question for Betty? Raise your hand or going across screen.
Yes.
Okay.
I think David Rose is.
Yeah. Hi, Betty. Amazing talk, and it just seems to me how fearless you were throughout this period. Were you aware of what was going on in Germany at the time?
No.
I was aware from the age of about 6, I think, by, as I said before, by reading the Stürmer, by seeing my father's shop being painted with don't buy from Jews, and etc., etc., etc. I was fully aware. Yes.
Thank you.
Can I ask a question? What was the reunion with your mother like, and how long was it before Ruth saw your mother?
The reunion with my mother was, how can I say, I felt that I had to look after my mother because of what she had suffered during the war on her own in England, in London, being bombed and not knowing where her children and her husband were. So it was really reversed, you know. Instead of she looking after me, I began to look after her. But don't forget that I also last saw her when I was 9 years old, just 9 years old, and I came back almost 16. So it's a long time, and a long, I've been on my own for a long, long time, and it was, I tried to help as much as I could.
We had to go very quickly when we were talking about Bronya coming back, but the reunion with Bronya, by this time there wasn't even a common language, was there?
There wasn't a common language, there was nothing, and she was so homesick for her Belgian family, for her mops and pops, and because here we had no father, mops, pops, and the 2 brothers and sister. And although she knew she had a brother, she had 2 sisters. She called one of her, she had rabbits, and she called one of the rabbits Betty. But she was homesick, and it took a long, 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 long time. And she really almost never forgave my mother for
She carried it through her life.
Yes, until she died unfortunately 2 years ago, but until say the last few years of her life, she resented my mother for taking her out of
the loving family in Belgium.
That's right.
Yeah. And when did Ruth? It was like 1955. It was quite a lot later, wasn't it?
But my mother went out to the kibbutz first to see her, and she came back absolutely devastated because Ruth lived in a strif in the kibbutz, and there was an outside toilet. And in fact, my mother told me when I went for the first time, she said, "Don't forget to take toilet paper," because they were cutting up newspaper.
Right.
Yeah. So she was a bit upset, to say
because if she would have come to London, she would have had an easier.
Well, my mother worked hard day and night to have enough money to buy a property for us. I mean, properties were much cheaper then, but somebody helped her, of course. Somebody from Stanford Hill, they helped her. I'm very, very grateful. In fact, before my first trip to Israel, my mother told me to buy some, the flat pack toilet paper. And Ruth never forgot that I came to the kibbutz with a toilet paper on his, it was still His Majesty the King.
Hallie, have you got a question?
With royal toilet paper.
Hi, Betty. We're still in Israel, and I wasn't able to be totally here in the conversation because of little Ori that you maybe can hear in the background. But I just want to say that we met for the first time at Lauren's weekly lessons, and I was thinking to myself, who is this lovely, happy woman? And it was only after Miriam Buchnik told me about you that I got to know you a little bit better. And then I read your sister's book, and I was so touched and amazed. And my question to you is, how come, after everything you've been through, you just remain so happy and so lively? I mean, just inspiring so much. Tell us how to do it. I mean,
Tali, you don't see me at night sometimes when I'm not quite so happy, but no, I'm happy. I'm especially happy to have joined this wonderful, or rejoined this wonderful, warm community who've just taken me in. What can I say? What can I say? It's just I made so many friends, including yourself, through being a member of South Hampstead. I don't know where to begin to thank. I wanted to thank Rabbi Shlomo and Rebbetzen Lindy and of course Linda Sharp for encouraging me to give this talk, and all the friends who've surrounded me. That's all I can say, Tanya.
I'd like to speak.
we love you, and I miss you a lot. And please God, we'll see each other again soon. We're still in Israel. I'm saying that
I would like to speak.
Lawrence,
You have a question.
Hello.
Lawrence, could I quickly say something? What people don't know is that when Betty and Alan were members of the shul in the earliest time, which was a time when you needed toilet paper for the outside loo, Betty and Alan were a fundamental part of the shul. At that time, if the angel would have arrived to Abraham and said, "Find me 10 people to keep Shabbat," Alan and Betty were the cornerstones at that time. And they continued with a crowd of emigres and a group of people with Monty Richardson, with a guy called several others, to have every Shabbat a Kiddush, even after you went to St. John's Wood, would stop at each other's houses. It was a very, very small and very tight community at that time. And I don't think Betty and Alan ever left the community, even though they weren't there for a spell. So Betty, you haven't joined this community. You never left it in the first place. What you found is a lot of new, young, wonderful people to look after, to pay attention, to give attention to everybody. And really, people don't realize that Betty is not a new member of the shul. She's never left our shul since she and Alan were the cornerstones.
I'd like to speak. Hi, Betty. Hi, Betty. Love from Jerusalem. It's Anne.
Hi, how are you?
I'm all right. I remember your mum so well. She was lovely.
She remembers your mum.
Ah, yes, she was lovely. Thank you, Anne.
Yeah.
Yeah, we go back a long time, don't we?
60 odd years.
We worked together at the Jewish Agency building in Great Russell Street.
Okay, lots of
We've remained friends ever since.
but we still talk.
We still talk occasionally.
Yeah.
Okay. it's almost past school. I just want to count on behalf of everyone who had the privilege to listen to Betty. Enormous thank you. And I haven't got any words. Your story is astonishing. I look forward to coming over and continuing our conversations. I've been very privileged to spend time with you in the last couple of weeks, and it's been wonderful. And I recommend it to anyone to go and spend a little bit of time with Betty. She'll lift your day. Absolutely.
Can we get some book signing, Lawrence?
Get some, sorry?
Some books signed.
Absolutely, definitely.
Anyway.
I can organise books.
Yeah, I'll sign them.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Rebbetzen Lauren, thank you so much. You were wonderful this morning, and we couldn't have done this without you either. So thank you.
It's my privilege, really. Thank you. Every time talking to Betty Lawrence, as you've just said, is a real treat. And for anybody who wants to know more, I really do recommend the books, A Girl Called Renee by Ruth, Betty's sister, which Betty's done so much in terms of working on the various translations after her sister's passing, is so beautifully written. And as well as describing her war experiences, it describes the pre-war life that they had so beautifully that actually I often pick it up with my children on Shabbat afternoon. And they're just mesmerized by these descriptions of, Berlin and Shabbat and Pesach, and there's a real taste of what things were like.
Yes.
So
incidentally, it's also been translated to German now.
So French, German, Hebrew, and English.
And English, and possibly will be in a year or so in Chinese.
Wow.
Somebody has contacted my nephew to say that the Chinese market is very, very interested in Holocaust stories.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for the opportunity. Please God, you should keep on inspiring all of us.
Thank you for devoting your Sunday morning, your precious Sunday morning, to coming here.
Thank you all.
You will, and I hope to see you. Bye.
Brilliant. Well done.